Welcome to Woman with Bunny Ears, a Twin Peaks podcast, Season 3, Episode 1, also known as We Want Headbands, a 4-syllable and 1-character podcast in baseline. Today we will be beginning our discussion of Project Lawful, aka Planecrash, and also the podcast It Makes Sense If You Understand Decision Theory, which is about that work, which is also called, after its acronym, I Miss Yud, or Yud, if you want to be literal about it. We will be covering up through Book 7 of Project Lawful, aka Planecrash, using the cako ordering, which will make sense to you in a minute once we explain that and how to find it. But you can also simply read up through the phrase, if he just wants to snuggle, him just snuggling is fine. I am your host, root of average of squares of deviations from average, Flashy Man.
And I am your co-host, Content Warning Math, Cakoluchiam. You can also call me Joseph if you so desire. It's probably easier on the tongue.
Nice. Are you all right if I call you Cako?
Cako is just fine.
Excellent.
That's the name that my guildies on Guild Wars back in the day went by.
Excellent.
Or I went by.
Right. So let's see. I guess we can explain why the ordering is named after you, but to do that, first we should probably explain what the story is. And it is basically a work of fiction that was written out as a series of forum posts on a specialized forum called Glowfic, which is specialized for writing fiction in this manner. There are various weird details about it, such as they call all of their posts tags, which doesn't make sense to me, but probably has some sort of etymological reason to be that way.
I think it's because in Glowfix you often have multiple authors and they're talking back and forth in a forum thread, and so they will put in their part of the story, and then when they're done, it is essentially a metaphorical tag your it to the next author to start. That is my understanding. I am not part of the Glowfic community, but I believe I picked that up from an earlier interview at the beginning of the previous podcast, which we are picking up.
Right. Okay. Anyhow, those tags are arranged into threads, which are just, as far as I can tell, sort of arbitrary, like, portions of the story, which, that's pretty usual as a thing to do for a book to have sections or whatever. And you can go to projectlawful.com to enjoy this work of fiction. And there will be an explanation of new readers start here, and it'll tell you the format. I mostly skipped over that. It's really self-explanatory, except for sometimes there's like a go to next post button, and that actually takes you to the next thread. So you just have to be aware of that. That's the only thing. And then
More alternatively,
Mhm.
I have there is an alternate way to read it, particularly for this podcast, which I've set up and hopefully will be maintaining for you guys. It's up there in full so far, so if I do neglect my work, it'll still be there. It just won't be as pretty. And that's I'm making a table of contents for it because these threads, aforementioned, tend to be very, very, very long. And what we said before, using the if he wants to snuggle line, that's how previous episodes, before we had a table of contents or format, would assign reading. And so you had to go and like remember to catch yourself at that particular tag, which could be easy to skip over if you are a speed reader, and that's worrisome. And also, I just don't like the navigation structure in general. So I'm putting together a table of contents which will be on a page that we will link in the show notes. As of right now, it is also uh, available at imsiyudt.com. That is the acronym for the previous podcast, I Miss Yud. Yeah. And so you can go there to follow along, and I will have them formatted by episode, so you can just click on the page for the episode, and that's what you'll be reading.
Yeah. So you've split them up into episodes, and also you've split them up into books and chapters. Is that correct? All of the content?
Right. So I believe the original idea of the authors was that each thread would be a book. But what you will discover if you are new to this Glowfic format is that the threads are much longer than most books you will ever encounter. I believe we're still in the first thread right now,
Oh
and
yeah.
we've reached somewhere around the 250,000 word mark, uh, which is a lot. I believe no printer would print that many words in a single volume. So calling it a book is a bit misleading. And I'm in my table of contents, I've got that listed as the thread title listed as the quote unquote volume, but I'm also separating them by quote unquote books, which are more like acts in a play. They are not necessarily a full story, but uh, I try to make them a thematic chunk, about 35,000 words in a piece. Uh, so so there's that, and then the chapters are just because I like having a way to remember what's going on, and we will be exploiting that uh, listing because for each chapter I've put a title that I hope is representative of the content without being too spoilery. And so, since we're picking up in the middle, we're going to go through the table of contents and summarize the story based on the chapter titles, uh, which I've kind of given away the next part of the podcast. So I'll hand over to
You gotta
Flashion for the rest of the intro.
you gotta tease them with the game show element that will come in probably an hour later once we're done explaining all of the other things that we
Yeah,
want to get to. Um, but yes, and you also have you have the books, which I've always thought it's funny when like a book that you purchase has sections and they're labeled book one, book two, book three, and they were never published individually. Because I'm
yeah.
like, that's not a book. I'm holding the book, idiot. What?
I think it's I think a historical thing. Like I
Sure.
believe, for example, the Bible, generally
Mm-hmm.
printed as one or two volumes, has a lot of books in it that are each. To be fair, they are like ostensibly written by different authors, so it kind of
Right.
makes sense for them to be separate as books, and they often tell
Right.
separate stories. But the idea is you've got a big volume, several sections that may or may not relate to each other, but we call them books,
Yeah.
which is confusing, I agree. But I'm just going with that uh, pattern because it's familiar to me.
Yeah. I guess my vague memory of like history is that back in the ye olden days, people would write scrolls, you know, and then when in the slightly less ye olden days, people got all those scrolls together and published codices, what we usually call a book. And so then they said, well, all of these each of these scrolls was basically a book. So now we're going to have book one, book two, book three, and so forth. I guess that just stuck around. Anyway, so you also have interludes. I saw you marked out.
Yeah, so my format that I'm going for is kind of something that was inspired by another web fiction by Wildbow. That's Worm. And Worm has a main storyline that goes chapter by chapter uh, and all follows the same character. but sometimes in order to know what's going on in this new world that the story goes on in, um, you need to change the perspective to a different character for a bit, and that character might not be recurring in the story as often as others, and so you just have a chapter that is titled Interlude, and it gives you a bit more background. We've had a little bit of that so far. Uh, I don't have a explicit format for what is or isn't an interlude, but what I'm trying to do is that they are something like this is either an aside that is a different set of characters doing something that is not immediately relevant to the uh, directed plot, or it is some kind of world building. And I've had to like rename the interludes as I've changed the standard by which I label them. But so far, we've got a couple of world building things from uh, Dathalon, which those who have been reading the story will know what I'm talking about, and those who don't, well, you'll find out. And a couple interludes that are lectures, which I hear there will be a lot more of in this story. Uh, Although these so far, as far as I know, are going to be the most math heavy ones that we've done before, and so I put those as interludes because really it's 20,000 words or whatever of just equations that could be summarized in 5 bullet points. So, for the sake of our readers, to keep them from leaving, I put that summary up there and added a link for you to skip that lecture. Uh, if you can handle the math, if you know, then and I would be concerned if you're trying to read a story like this without the ability to handle math. It would be great to be able to spread that, but I would also feel really bad for you. Uh, I recommend reading those lectures because they're cool and I enjoy them, but I also have a degree in mathematics, and so I can more or less understand them, and I also clearly have a bias of enjoying math. But yeah, so there are a couple of interludes there, and that is one of the things I am calling an interlude.
All right. Well, yeah. The point is that there is an ordering of these things that is shorter than just reading the entire 500,000 word thread to discuss it, and you can follow along that way. I myself do not use this delightful website. I just load the EPUBs, which you can also get somewhere around the internet,
You, of course,
into
have a different reason for doing that.
yes. I load them into a text to speech app on my phone, and I listen to them at 2 times the default speed as I walk around lovely forest trails. And that's been a very good experience for me.
I also feel very sorry for you for the math section. That would be terrifying for me listening to mathematics. That is very. You want to see this on a chalkboard, uh, heavy,
Yeah.
just
I
in audio
basically
format.
I basically don't try on those, especially because I already know most of the math that's been gone over because I read the sequences, among other
Right.
things. So, they're like, here are the axioms, and here's a proof we can make out of it. And I just say, I'll trust ya.
Yeah.
I'll trust ya.
Yeah.
And then also, there's an especially bad part where the EPUB that I'm using, uh, so the or symbol is made out typographically of ASCII characters backslash and then forward slash, and that makes the sort of down pointing hollow arrow.
Right.
But because of technology, the backslash has been removed for my EPUBs. So it's just mixing together the slash that means division and the slash that means logical or, and everything's very confusing.
Does it just read it as slash?
I think my text-to-speech program is smart enough that it reads it as divided by, which
Oh,
is
I don't know if
cool.
I'd call that smart enough because with the
It's pretty
or
good.
operator, often people will use a slash, not just in writing but in speech, when they want to refer to two things that are either similar or AKA. Um, and that kind of
Right.
makes sense for or is like you can call it this or you can call it this. You can
Well,
call it this slash this.
or it's it's contextual, the text-to-speech app I have. So if it's numbers, it'll tell you divided by. If it's
Oh, that's
words,
nice.
I think it just tells you slash. Sometimes it doesn't say anything. Occasionally, very occasionally, it will read out uh, certain strings of divisions as like a date. I recently
Ooh.
got one that was like, one half something something something, and it read it as the first or the second of October, 1998 or something, which was crazy.
That is, yeah, one
So,
one way to read the math in this. That actually, that's a thing that bothers me in uh, spreadsheet programs is when I want to type something slash another thing, and it'll just automatically format it as a date. And then the problem is dates in spreadsheet programs are represented like internally or whatever by some long string uh, of numbers that is like the number of milliseconds since epoch or something, or they've got some other representation. But basically, what it means is if I turn the format from date to something else, instead of putting it back as this slash that, it'll put in whatever that number is, which is not the number I entered. Anyhow, that is very relevant to this story. So I just wanted to make
yeah.
sure you guys all had that background.
So, continuing our explanation, this story is written by Eliezer Yudkowsky and Kelsey Piper, two people notable in the rationalist community and good writers, I will say. So,
Indeed.
this could be a perfect time to launch into any extended digressions about uh, your involvement with rationalism, ratfic, how you found this story, etc., so forth, if you feel like it.
Sure. I mean, I'll start with this podcast. Just that uh, this podcast that we're doing comes from a podcast produced by uh, uh, podcasters from the Bayesian Conspiracy, at least one of whom previously did the audiobook for uh, the Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality rationalist fanfic. That being also written by Eliezer Yudkowsky, and the audiobook was arranged by Eneasz Brodsky, who was the previous host of this podcast, along with Steven Zuber. Um,
Yeah.
and so I got into this because I was listening to that podcast, the audiobook, and it just sort of rolled into an analysis of that and then an analysis of other rationalist fiction, ratfic, or adjacent, um, and eventually came to Planecrash, aka Project Lawful, aka Mad Investor Chaos, and the Woman of Asmodeus. Uh, so that's uh, what brought me to this particular podcast. But somewhere along the way, they mentioned the Discord for the Bayesian conspiracy, which is where the community that uh, helped inspire us to continue the podcast meets. And so we should also link the Discord in the show note so anybody new who is not already a member of the can join there. Um, uh,
Sure.
as for the rationalist community, uh, I think I actually may have gotten introduced to the community through Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, like many people. I was just reading Harry Potter fanfic at the time, which I'm a little bit ashamed to talk about, but not too ashamed. I was young, I was dumb. Um, but also, fun fact, I used to uh, engage in a RP forum with Scott Alexander, who was also a member of that, uh, and that had elements of the glowfic format to it. So we had some forums that were dedicated to making stories collaboratively with other people um, in a back and forth tag your it format. That's why I mentioned that. Also because I like, throwing out some street cred. Uh, uh,
Nice.
so that, and I'm a nerd. I majored in mathematics and got most of my credits for that major in high school uh, because that's just how much I enjoy math. And so, and a lot of math is making formal arguments, which is a lot of what the rationalist culture uh, includes and enjoys. So I stuck with it once I found it through Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. Um,
Ooh,
how about you? Yourself,
nice.
Flashy Man?
Uh, Sorry, what was that?
How about yourself, Flashy Man?
Yes, yes. Well, I've been vaguely aware of all of this community for a long time. In terms of this particular podcast and working backwards, the previous hosts of the current hosts of the previous podcast, whatever, they started reading this Planecrash book and doing an analysis podcast of it. And uh, I thought they might perhaps be doing a reading of Planecrash out loud, like they did a reading of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality
Oh my,
as a narrative.
that
And I
I
thought, hmm
that actually does sound like it would be cool to hear. Um,
yeah,
I do prefer audiobooks in general, so uh,
hmm
I agree, and particularly with the fact that the characters in this story come from different people. It would be neat to have the influence of uh, those different people in reading off the different characters. I think that would be cool.
yeah.
But it's
It would
also
also,
over a million words, so that would be a
yeah,
big commitment for anybody.
a huge amount of work, certainly. And I guess now is as good of a time as any to mention that there is also an AI text to speech version of this book that is currently being produced by Ask Who somewhere out there on the internet. I guess we'll link to it and you can support it and listen along. You will not be able to follow along with this podcast synchronously because they're very far behind because again, hundreds of thousands of words. Uh, but
Yeah,
that is pretty good. It's like the AI is good enough that it gets more of the natural human speech rhythms and so forth. Whereas my AI, uh, very primitive AI text to speech, it has all of the words correct, but the, you know, intonation, does it sound like a human? No. Uh, in some
yeah,
ways, that's better because once you get used to it, it doesn't have like misleading intonation or anything. But it certainly is less pleasant. Um, so, yes, I started listening to the podcast, the analysis podcast, and I was enjoying it, even though I wasn't reading the story at that point. But I enjoyed what was described so much that I decided I should read it. And I was dreading that because what am I going to do? Sit at my computer and read 2 million words? That doesn't sound very fun. And I discovered these AI voicings, and I read some of it and quickly ran out of the AI voice copies. And then I decided to just bite the bullet and also discovered the EPUB, which is good because if you try to run the HTML of the page through text to speech, then you get a lot of timestamps, which isn't very good
oof,
because
yeah,
then it pauses to read a huge timestamp in between every post, and some of the posts can be quite quick.
Right.
So yeah,
Especially those
just
reaction posts that are literally just a picture with a dash in the text
yeah.
box.
Naturally, I do not see the pictures, but it's just as effective to have an empty post. I guess I'll just start calling them tags. An empty tag, it's just like the character name happens twice, and then yeah, they're doing a good reaction in there.
They are
Nice.
taking a moment to think about what they just heard.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So yes, I read past the point where the I Miss Yud podcast hosts were reading. Even I've even read far beyond where this podcast will start up, but I will just always pretend not to have and work off the knowledge and thoughts that I had at the time, unless I screw up, in which case, sorry. But
it happens.
yes, then the podcast hosts, the illustrious and wonderful podcast hosts of the previous podcast, said they weren't really enjoying it as much as they thought, and they had started it as an experiment, and the experiment had successfully returned the bad result, or the negative result,
A
I
negative
suppose.
result. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so they were going to move on, and they kind of hoped that somebody else would have a podcast or a book club so that the community that was reading along could continue to read along and have fun discussions and so forth. And I believe you were proposing that you could do one and sort of hunting around for a partner. And I thought to myself, as I had just joined the Discord and said very little of anything, that it would be extremely funny if I, an unrelated stranger, decided to be the second host. And also, I'd been doing this podcast for a while.
Which is
And so
very
this,
handy because one of the
yeah,
things that was holding me back from just jumping into doing it was I have never done a podcast or really anything remotely like it before, and I had no idea where to start. But luckily, you did a bunch of the legwork up front for me, and it's nice to have a partner that can help me figure it out, what needs to yet be figured out.
well, thank you. And lest ye be under any illusions, I am definitely not doing this at a professional quality, but it's at a good enough quality, hopefully. So, yes. But how, you might ask, did I come across this other podcast?
How
Well,
did
first
you
of
come
all,
across this other podcast, Flashy Man?
I was just sort of plugged in enough to this sphere that when Planecrash was announced by Eliezer Yudkowsky, I knew about it. Like, I saw the posts announcing it. And I thought, oh, well, I enjoy this man's writing. I mean, I've listened to the entirety of Rationality from AI to Zombies, for example,
Really?
and thought
Wow.
that was pretty good. So I'd be down to read this. Oh, it's like a bunch of forum posts, and furthermore, it's not an audiobook. I uh but then also it so happened that around a couple of months ago, I decided to read Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality all the way to the finish, because I read it when it was originally coming out, and then it sort of went on hiatus for a while. I wasn't really paying close attention, but I stopped reading there, sort of like 2/3 of the way through the story or whatever. And I decided to get back around to finishing it because it is an incredible novel, in my opinion. And it
I would
was
agree.
great. And so I was, poking around the Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality podcast website, hpmor.com, and I found this other project that they had just started. And that's the winding tale of how I got here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, that's cool. And speaking of websites, those of you who have not come here from that other podcast, that podcast is a spin-off of the Methods of Rationality podcast, which did the audiobook. And you can find that and all their previous works at hpmorpodcast.com. We have nothing to do with that, so blame them if you have any problems with it.
That's true.
But
Also,
it is well produced, and I
yes.
appreciate that they put everything together. I have not done that for this podcast yet, so they've got one up on us.
True. True. Yes. Also, yeah, you can blame them for the concept of this podcast, but not the execution.
That is true.
So,
That is true.
yeah.
They have nothing to do with this podcast going forward, or even from the start of this episode. They have no input. We in fact have disowned them. We will never be
What?
speaking with them again.
Oh, God. You can't let me get cut out of the will.
Nope. It's too bad. It's necessary. We need a clean break so that we do not get their personalities diluting our content.
Yes. We don't want their established audience and expertise and affable personalities. None of
Yeah,
that.
none of that. If you came here from the other podcast, turn it off and leave now. That is of course a joke. Please keep listening. We need the followers. We
And
actually don't. We're doing this because we love it,
that's true.
but it'd be great to have you.
I believe we also have a, a blessing from the other podcasts. Maybe it's just a generalized blessing. Maybe it's a specific blessing. Who can say? But they didn't say don't nobody do this. They said the opposite of that, and that's good
Right.
enough for me.
And we should probably at some point take them up on the offer to have a brief interview that they can post on their feed in case anybody there did not pick up this podcast from the Discord. So, so that's another reason for all of you listeners to go back and listen to their podcasts as well, which again, I have
don't know
nothing
about
to
this.
do with, but I do think they've got a lot of great stuff there, including the very well produced audiobook for Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. That is the last
True.
time I will mention it here.
Yes. Changing topics because I think we've covered that one successfully. Do you have experience with D&D or Pathfinder? Because this story is set in the Pathfinder universe and uses Pathfinder mechanics.
So,
And Pathfinder is like a variant of D&D. I'm not really clear on exactly what it is, but
well, I can tell you something about
oh,
that. Um, uh, so I do have a little bit of experience with Pathfinder. I've played maybe 3 modules of
cool.
one campaign in it, which is not a lot, but it was set in Cheliax, which is where this story is set in. So I have a little bit of background on that, but really not very much because, only one campaign and we only went so far out of the city that the main plot took place in. So I don't have a lot of background in the lore. However, I did start playing Dungeons and Dragons back when I was. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but it was. I started with, I believe, AD&D Second Edition. Uh, I don't know how old it was then when I picked it up, uh, but I enjoyed it and continued into version 3 and then version 3.5. And at that point, there were a lot of people who were kind of on the fence about the direction of where D&D was going, especially by the time of D&D 4th edition. And some of them decided, you know what, screw this, we're going to make our own role-playing system with blackjack and hookers. And they went off and took almost all the rules from Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition. I forget whether they included 3.5. I don't think so. And they modified them quite a bit, actually, and published it as under the Open Gaming License, the OGL, for those in the know. And it took off. There are lots of people who play Pathfinder. There is a Pathfinder Society, which is a national, if not international, organization that runs campaigns set in official Pathfinder settings, such as Galarian and Cheliax,
Mm.
with lots of people that basically they, as far as I know, and I haven't actually interacted with them, but my understanding is that uh, the campaigns in the Pathfinder Society sometimes influence the direction of the canon universe. So it's a very uh, extensive and fan friendly role playing game system and community. They do a lot of they opened it up a lot for homebrew content and other editors to come in and add to the system. And they have active forums for feedback where the developers chat with people who have questions, which is really great. So anyhow, yeah, it's a lot of Pathfinder 1, at least, is based on D&D 3 or 3.5. And I know a lot of that very well. But that's just the mechanics. And that's come up a couple of times in this story. One notable example being the headbands, which is a thing in Pathfinder that uh, you have ability scores, which are your traits such as strength and intelligence, and those are generated by rolling dice. And so they have a distribution, and it falls somewhere around average 13 ish, but can go up as high as 18, higher if you've got racial modifiers or whatever. Um, and so 18 and higher is a very high score. I believe the main character of this story so far has an intelligence level of 18. Is that correct?
I
Am I
believe so,
recall?
yes.
Yeah. And the headbands are enchanted in order to give you flat bonuses to your scores. So it would bring an 18 up to a 20, which is huge. Or I think they go up to +4, which would be a 22, which is even huger, very big. And what the ability scores do is every 2 points in the ability score, you increase your rolls related to that ability. Uh, you increase the value of your d20 rolls by 1, which is a pretty good improvement when you're trying to meet things that are usually within a range of 5 points from the target that you're trying to aim for. So +1 is pretty good. Uh, and then there's also skills. There's also spells, which we will have encountered in this story. So far, we've encountered a few spell casting systems: the wizards, the clerics, the oracles. I don't know that we've covered much of oracle yet, but that is something that we may see more of.
Yeah, I think that, as long as you go into this story knowing about the concept of like D&D or a tabletop role-playing system that involves rolling dice, and possibly the idea that a D20 is a 20-sided die,
Uh,
then you're fine. You'll just get introduced to things as the main character is.
Yeah, one of the
Um,
interesting things about the story so far is it's not clear uh, exactly how aware the people in the story, the characters in the story, are that the mechanics of their world is sort of gamified. I don't know if they actually know the, the name uh, int or use magic device as a skill, but they do reference them throughout the story. So there's a lot of referencing, hey, failure will save, and then tell me that, uh,
was really
and
weird.
which is weird if you don't know that that means a save is roll a d20, and if it's below a certain amount, then bad stuff happens. So there are some mechanics that are explicitly spelled out in the story. It's not clear how much of that the characters are aware of. One of the things in role playing systems is often that in combat or any other time sensitive interaction, uh, every action happens once every 6 seconds or 10 seconds or 1 minute, depending on what system you're in. And in some fan fiction, I've seen that actually be a thing that happens where characters can only cast a spell once every 6 seconds, and they know that as a magic number, uh, and it happens, and it's weird for anybody not in that system coming in and discovering that. But we haven't seen anything like that here, where the newbie Keltham has identified a system in the magic that is terribly gameable. Uh, well, he has sort of, but like not something that is completely out of the ordinary. He's very accepting of strange things. Uh, and I don't think he sees this and is like, things can only happen once every 6 seconds, or uh, this person looks like they should have been able to climb up those stairs, but for whatever reason they literally cannot take the first step, because of course in the role playing system, difficult terrain often takes more than a round to enter or cross, and stairs would be difficult terrain, and sometimes you have to roll in order to actually enter it. There are things in the role playing system that would be very weird for anybody entering. But so far, it's just for Keltham, it's like, oh, there's magic here. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's move on. Uh,
Yeah, I'm willing to accept a lot of the, like, they bring up a lot of the role playing terms are just the terms that the people in this world use for things. And that seems fine to me, like their unit of time, one of their units of time is a round, which is 6 seconds. Checks out.
Indeed. And I think that also it's interesting that Keltham comes from an alternate timeline of Earth, basically. But one of the properties of that alternate timeline is that they decided it makes more sense to count ace 12 than ace 10, which is convenient for, for example, when you have 6 second rounds, that's, half of a 12. So there are some cool agreements there that wouldn't be there if everybody were. So it also looks less out of the ordinary.
Sure. Perhaps.
Cool.
Perhaps. Well, I figure there are two things we could do now, uh, depending on how you're feeling about them, or if you have any other ideas. And one is we could say how we feel about the story so far. Although now that I think about it, I'm just going to say, yep, pretty good story so far.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think that's a fair summary. Uh, I do agree a bit with the with Eneash and Steven that it's going slower than ideal for a weekly podcast with short amounts of reading, which
correct.
I'm going to try to make up for in this podcast. We're gonna do hopefully a bit more per week. Right now, we have sketched out a quote unquote book, which is about 30,000, 35,000 words. Before, we were doing somewhere around 17,000 words per week. So this is going to be a bit faster, but the thing with this format is it goes by quick. Well, you get pulled into it. I do. People do. People always,
Me
or
as well.
people often want to continue reading, and it sucks trying to cut off, particularly in the middle of the scene, which is why I would like to have the cutoffs at books, which I'm trying to keep thematically contained. So hopefully we get enough content to keep people around. But yeah, I like it. We've just, as of the end of the uh, last podcast, encountered our first sex scene, which I believe is also a common thing among glowfic, being, of course, a related to role-playing forums. Not terribly surprising that such a thing shows up. Also, it's in the content warnings at the beginning, but now we know why. It
It's
was
also
very lascivious.
ooh, yeah, they talked about all sorts of equilibria and signalings and so forth.
And I believe slavery is up.
Wow.
All the good sorts of stuff you talk about in bed with your partner in the privacy of your yeah. So how about you? That you said just it's going well so far. Anything
Yeah,
on that?
I guess you commenting on it reminded me of two things. The first thing is that the section we were just discussing is in its own subthread, which is just a separate thread that is linked to when you should read it. And there's also a summary of that subthread, and or you could just skip it totally if you wanted to. And in my opinion, you should just read it. It's not even it's nothing to worry about. And the summary is very competent, and I read it. I read the first summary as well to know if there was anything I was missing by not reading the summary. Nah, it's pretty much just summary excerpts of the original parts where that is convenient. So that my officially endorsed stance is you should just read it when it says to read it. It's fine.
Yeah,
If you don't
it
want to,
helps. I
don't.
think
But whatever.
it helps. I think to have the context in which the stuff in the summary comes up, even if that is a little lewd. It says
Risque.
well, yeah, risque. It says not safe for work, but I mean it's text. They don't have any like graphic images. I would not recommend you know uh, pulling it out at work and trying to get off to that. But just reading it, it's not that
You got to start doing
explicit.
live readings of this at work.
Hmm.
It's the only way you'll get promoted.
Yeah. Except of course, the climax, shall we say, that is pretty explicit.
Yeah.
But you've got a
Yeah.
little bit of warning for
Yeah. Actually, other than that, it's like, this story, for all its build up as, ooh, there might be something sexual in here. It's not really. It's almost like every other book where they're just like, and then they laid together. Moving on to the interesting stuff about
indeed.
mechanics.
And decision theory. And
Yeah,
deal, of course.
indeed.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that
which
actually was
yeah.
part of the thing that turned off the previous hosts, pun intended, was that it was advertised as lewd and did not deliver as well as one seeking it for that purpose might hope.
That was a really surprising twist to me because I figured if anything they would be turned off in the opposite direction. If
Oh, I
characters were
think
being too lewd, and they would go, "Oh my god, we can't say this on a podcast."
I would say actually the opposite because if you know Inyash,
Yeah.
I would expect that he would be reading this for the explicit scenes.
Yes. Well, I have now updated to your position with the benefit of hindsight.
Indeed.
Yes.
No pun intended there, I'm sure. Eh,
Well, posterior, the hindsight, they're all connected.
they
It's all
really
because
are.
because of the nature of time, obviously, is what I'm referring to.
Yes.
Goes in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, my other comment about this book is, it's long, but you just got to read it fast. You just got to read fast, and then the pages fly by. There's a bunch of people going, what do we think we're gonna do now? And then they discuss it. But those just fly by, and then they go do the thing. And then once you're going fast enough to have fun, it's like you realize, oh my god, I have so much of this to look forward to now that I'm enjoying it. I just
There
read,
are another million words.
yeah, I just read 50,000 words, and that was pretty good. I hope they wrote like 20 more sequels to this or something. Whoa!
Hello, they did. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
This is completely unrelated, strictly speaking, but it reminds me a lot of my experience watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which I just watched the anime instead of reading the manga because I never learned how to read. But
oh, yeah.
the point I'm trying to make is that, JoJo has gone on for many seasons and many more volumes of the manga besides. And watching it, since I enjoy it, most shows I'm like, you listen, end your show.
Yeah.
End
How
the show when it's good.
when,
I will enjoy it as a whole. But for
before it
JoJo,
becomes Naruto, let's say.
yeah. But for JoJo, I'm watching along, and it helps that they change the main characters every so often, so it keeps it fresh.
Mhm.
But I'm watching along, and I'm like, you could just make this forever. I would love it if you just kept making JoJo
Yeah.
forever. It's
It's
pretty good.
so I actually haven't seen or read JoJo. Is it largely a serial or is it episodic, would you say?
Uh, There, it's funny you would say that because I think of a serial as inherently being episodic, but it's
Yeah.
definitely. I get what you're saying, and it's episodic. Definitely, they have like, now we met this guy and we're gonna fight him. Now we met this other guy and we're gonna fight him.
Hmm.
And then there's your overarching story, and
Right. Yeah, I think episodic stories are a lot better at the uh not turning you off by it going on too long thing. One
certainly.
might also point to Supernatural as well of this, where fans just kept following it, and it had an arc to each season, but largely it was still monster of the week, so to speak, and so it was something different all the time, even though you've got the same characters. They change each season. Not uh, who the characters are, but what comprises the character's personality. I think changes each season in Supernatural, which is an interesting thing to follow. But this is not a Supernatural podcast. This is, in fact, a Twin Peaks podcast, and so we should be
True.
discussing Planecrash, I
Right.
believe.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yes.
let's.
Oh, here's another general note. I read like 1,000 words into Plane Crash, and then I got the joke of why it's called Plane Crash.
1,000 words later.
Yeah, it wasn't even like he said, "Boy, what a plane crash!" Am I right? I just went. I was actually investigating, like, so is this thing called Project Lawful or Plane Crash? And I believe my answer is I believe it was originally titled Plane Crash, and then later it becomes titled Project Lawful because that seems like a good title for it once it's been written out and
My
the
expect
direction it's gone is taken.
my interpretation is that it was probably titled Plane Crash for the benefit of people just reading the first few pages, let's say, if not chapters at that point, where it makes sense pretty well because it is, based on a plane crash. And so you will remember it by that. And Project Lawful doesn't really come into play until I think even further past where we have encountered. I think you can see the hints of what might be called Project Lawful, but I don't know that it's been called out by that title in the text, at least not yet. But so it would be Plane Crash while they're starting out the story, but as it becomes more clear to the reader and it becomes less of a spoiler, let's say, then it can be Project Lawful.
Yeah, but I
The
mean,
actually, I
if a
think
book is titled something, you're not like, and especially something vague like Project Lawful, you're not like, what is Project Lawful? Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's like, there's some stuff going on in this book. That's my title, you
there
know?
is also, like, by the nature of Glowfic, the possibility that this did not actually start out with a plan for it to become Project Lawful. The first thread was titled Mad Investor Chaos and the Woman of Asmodeus, which basically is a summary of chapter 1, let's say, right? You've got this guy
Well,
who I believe even explicitly calls himself Mad Investor Chaos, or mentions that they used to call him that on Dathalon. And the first person he meets, like actually meets in a language he can understand, is a woman who worships Asmodeus. So it could just be like, hey, I have this character, and you have this character. Let's throw them together and see what happens. And my impression is that's sort of what the format of a lot of Glowfic is the various people in the community have their own personal characters, and one of the fun things they do is they just throw them together and
yeah,
see what happens.
I have no idea how much of this was planned in advance. Couldn't tell you. Couldn't even guess.
There definitely was a lot of it planned in some amount of advance because there is
Yeah.
a separate forum or board on the page for planning threads.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the things that I think Ineash and Steven didn't quite realize in their podcast because they often commented on like how close together the posts were. That like uh, Eliezer posted this, and it's just this big thing, and then immediately right after, we've got this response from Kelsey, and the timestamps. Look at the timestamps; they're like 2 minutes apart, and I think that's less because they actually were interacting in real time, and more because once you've done all that planning, you just sort of sit down with the person you're writing with and move the tags over or copy and paste them into the official thread after you've refined them in your planning thread. So I think there's less to interpret about the timestamps in the story itself, or in the meta narrative, the meta story, than might be apparent at first glance.
Well,
Just
that's very
because
interesting.
there is planning going on behind the scenes, and some of it may just be strictly writing this out so that you can copy and paste it later. In fact, I'm not sure, but I think on projectlawful.com, which is a mirror of the Glowfix, I think they don't have time. But let me check that.
That's a specific formatting choice. They're just like
Oh,
completely transparent.
right. Oh, you can see the timestamps. I'm kidding. Maybe there's a setting where you can.
Yeah.
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 So don't listen to me. I lie to you all the time.
I always tell the truth.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I will absolutely trust you 100%, especially during our game show, which
Indeed.
I think it's a perfect time to introduce, unless you've got
It would
other
be,
pressing
but
matters.
with your like very reasonable and like related to real life discussion of the meta there, I have a whole space brain galaxy thing to discuss about the meta,
Oh
which
my
occurred to
goodness.
me the other day. Because so one of the characters in the story is from Dathalon, which
All right.
is like
What
a
is
parallel universe.
Dathalon?
What's that?
What is Dathalon, Flashy Man?
Ah, it's like a parallel universe, and every April Fool's Day, maybe some April Fool's Days at some points in the recent past,
May or
Eliezer
may not be
Yudkowsky.
more than one.
I'm pretty sure it's more than one.
Oh,
Eliezer
cool.
Yudkowsky said, "Hey, folks, I'm actually not that special at all. I'm an average Joe from a parallel universe called Dath Elon. Or I guess the universe isn't called Dath Elon. That's what they call their planet, like instead of Earth.
Right.
And
And I think, yeah, I think
Mhm.
it's the planet. I think they call their civilization capital C civilization,
Right.
and which would be like their equivalent of a country, but they've got a one world government, is my
Yeah.
impression.
I
Um,
think I
Whereas
think they're kind of more
Dathalon,
like a global community, but they all coordinate so well that it's kind of like a one world government with a lot of special zones.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think the mobility part uh, of the world makes it less centralized. People don't need to identify as strongly with their quote unquote country, their local community. They can just be them. They can say, "Oh yeah, I belong to Dart Club, um, the science fiction club," and they could say the same for whatever stands for government or organizational structure. I think that's my impression, but I might just be carrying that over from Terra Ignota, which we can talk about some other time. Or you could
Well,
follow the other podcast, Too Rash, Too Unadvised, which is a similar format to this, which talks about Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota. And now we can stop talking about that.
right. So anyway, Eliezer says, I'm actually just an average guy from a parallel universe called Dathilon, which is like Earth, except everyone's actually been making a serious effort at being competent and so forth.
What?
So
You mean they're
they,
not doing that here?
wow. Here's a book called Inadequate Equilibria, which our favorite parallel universe hopping friend wrote to explain why his new universe is so terrible.
Oh my.
Yes. So he's done some like Q&As about this Dathilon thing, keeping up the April Fool's pretense that he's actually from there. You could call it a bit, perhaps, that he's doing. And then, so you have that. And then he writes this fiction that also has a character like from Dathilon who's explaining various things about Dathilon. And it makes me wonder. So Eliezer has sort of, in one level of fiction, established that he's from Dathilon. The real human Eliezer is from Dathilon, fictionally. And he's also writing about this separate sort of set of things related to Dathilon. And there are parts that are even like, things that happen in Dathilon sometimes, very rarely, maybe another Glowfix. And so that sort of raises the question, did the fictional Eliezer who lived in Dathilon write this story? Does that mean this story is fictional from the real Dathilon's standpoint, if we're pretending it's real? So this is
I
like
was thinking you
double
were
fiction?
going somewhere like that. I think adjacent to that, I was thinking, all right, so if Eliezer is from Dathalon, and if we take that at face value, then if this story is about somebody from Dathalon entering Golarion, uh, does that mean that from the perspective of Dathalon, Golarion similarly is real, or at least as real as Eliezer's existence there? Um, I know Keltham. I think Keltham has said that they uh, that Golarion is not known of in Dathalon. Is that correct? Or at least that he
Well,
didn't know
yeah.
of it.
I think it's just like a completely parallel universe that they would have no way of knowing about.
Uh-huh. But yeah, if we take it at face value that Dathalon exists and that Eliezer tells us about Dathalon every April 1st, is this as you suggest a fiction in Dathalon that he's bringing here, or potentially is it biographical or autobiographical even? Since Eliezer himself is a planes traveler.
True.
This could
But
have been.
noticing the pseudo autobiographical parallels, that's table stakes. That's already in there. Especially the very funny to me thing where he establishes that a common fictional practice in Dathilon is to imagine a world that you were the average citizen of, because
Oh
that's
yeah,
how he came up with Dathilon in real life. So of course they have that particular procedure as a popular fiction thing in Dathilon.
I think actually that might be our first interlude in my table of contents, if I recall correctly.
Nice.
That might have been a previous version, but yeah. So don't skip the interludes if you are interested in the history of Dathalon. The very first interlude is in fact a post or a tag whose character is Dathalon.
An upside down Earth.
An upside down Earth, yes. So parallel but reverse. Interesting.
Although part of me wonders.
It's not upside down. It's actually just rotated, I think, right? Because that's Africa and it's still facing the correct direction.
Oh, so you're just saying it's been rotated upside down instead of being flipped upside down.
Right. So
Right.
it's
Okay.
still Earth. It's just they think of the South Pole as the North Pole.
Yeah. And I don't know. When I saw that picture, I initially thought, oh, it's funny. They're in the parallel universe, so their Earth is just arbitrarily upside down. But now I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, do they just have like some sort of? They were like, of course, North goes down. You idiot! That's the natural way to do things because of the right hand rule and electron flows, or some
Oh, the right
Dathalon
hand
reason.
rule bothers
I'm
me
making
so
stuff up.
much that the standard for the opposite direction of current.
That's probably related to magnets somehow.
I'm sure it is. It's just
Yeah,
irritating from the level of an amateur, just like learning
right,
about it at a surface level, that
right.
electrons go one way and current goes the other way makes no sense and is not good for remembering how the right hand rule works. Right. So
So
Dathalon.
yes, but do you understand the question I'm raising? Like in Eliezer's personal backstory, which I will stop calling fictional now, even though it is fictional for the purpose of clarity. His backstory is about being from Dathalon, and then he's writing this story about a guy who he would never have, interacted with. Presumably, I don't know. Maybe he also, met this guy or has a universe scrying machine or something, who comes from Dathalon. So is Eliezer, who is really from Dathalon, also writing about a fictional Dathalon in his stories, even though all the details are the same? Or,
Or
uh,
are the details the same?
yeah,
That's another question. We've only seen a little bit of Keltham's perspective. And
or Keltham and everything connected to the real fictional Dathalon is all part of Eliezer's backstory somehow. It's all canon.
yep. So I don't know. Maybe as we read more of the story, we will figure this out more.
Likely. But we should play the game show.
The game show portion has been moved to its own episode. Next episode.